She read an interesting book by the fireplace during the storm. As the rain pounded against the windows and the wind howled through the trees outside, I couldn't help but feel a shiver down my spine. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the eerie silence that had fallen over the village. I had always been fascinated by stories of mysterious disappearances, so when I heard about the village near Machu Picchu where everyone had vanished overnight, I knew I had to investigate. As a journalist, it was my job to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. So, I packed my bags and set off for Peru, hoping to get to the bottom of this strange case. The journey to Machu Picchu was long and exhausting. I took a flight to Cusco, then a train to Aguas Calientes, the small town at the base of the mountain. From there, it was a steep climb to the ancient citadel, but I was determined to see it for myself. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the ruins. The village in question was a short hike from Machu Picchu. It was a small, isolated community that had lived in the shadow of the ancient Inca site for generations. According to the few reports I could find, the villagers had all vanished one night, leaving their homes and belongings behind. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues as to where they might have gone. It was as if they had simply evaporated into thin air. I spent my first night in a small guest house in Aguas Calientes, gathering my strength for the hike ahead. The storm rolled in that evening, and I found myself sitting by the fireplace in the common room, reading a book I had picked up at the local market. The storm outside was relentless, but inside, it was warm and cozy. I felt a strange sense of unease, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The next morning, the storm had passed, and I set off for the village. The trail was muddy and slippery from the rain, but the air was fresh and cool. As I climbed higher into the mountains, I couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the landscape. The towering peaks, the lush green valleys, and the ancient stone terraces of Machu Picchu in the distance, it was breathtaking. I reached the village by mid-morning. It was exactly as the reports had described, a cluster of small, stone houses, all abandoned. Doors hung open, windows were shattered, and the streets were eerily quiet. I felt a chill as I walked through the empty village, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. I started my investigation by looking through the houses. Most of them were simple, one-room structures with dirt floors and thatched roofs. There were signs of everyday life, cooking pots on the hearth, clothes hanging on lines, and half-eaten meals still on the tables. It was as if the villagers had left in a hurry, but there were no signs of violence or struggle. As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was unnerving, to say the least. In one of the houses, I found a journal. It belonged to a man named Miguel, who seemed to be the village leader. The last few entries were particularly disturbing. Miguel wrote about strange occurrences in the village, shadows that moved on their own, whispers in the night, and a growing sense of dread among the villagers. He mentioned that people were seeing figures out of the corner of their eyes, but when they turned to look, the figures were gone. The final entry was hastily scrawled and almost illegible, but I could make out a few words. "They are coming. We must leave now." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. What could have scared the villagers so much that they abandoned their homes in the middle of the night? I decided to take a break and sat down on a stone bench in the village square, trying to make sense of what I had found. As I sat there, I became aware of a growing sense of unease. The shadows seemed to be closing in around me, and I could hear faint whispers on the wind. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I decided to leave the village and head back to Aguas Calientes. Maybe a good night's sleep would help clear my mind. The hike back was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. By the time I reached the guest house, I was exhausted and on edge. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was back in the village, but it was alive with people. They went about their daily routines, seemingly unaware of my presence. But as I walked through the streets, I noticed that their faces were blank, their eyes empty. It was as if they were there, but not really there. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The next day, I decided to return to the village, determined to find more answers. As I explored further, I found more evidence of the villagers' hurried departure, personal belongings left behind, food rotting on the tables, and even a child's doll lying in the dirt. It was as if they had left in a blind panic. As I walked through the village, I started to notice something strange. The shadows seemed to be moving on their own, shifting and darting out of the corner of my eye. I felt a growing sense of dread, but I forced myself to keep going. I needed to find out what had happened to these people. In one of the larger houses, I found a series of strange symbols carved into the walls. They looked ancient, and I couldn't make sense of them. As I examined the carvings, I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just an empty room and the sound of my own breathing. I decided to leave the house and continue my search outside. As I stepped into the village square, I felt a sudden chill. The shadows around me seemed to grow darker, and I could hear faint whispers on the wind. I turned in a slow circle, trying to see where the whispers were coming from, but there was nothing there. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the village. It was tall and thin, with long, dark hair and hollow eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart was racing, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I decided it was time to leave. Whatever was happening in this village, I didn't want to be a part of it. I hurried back to Aguascalientes, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I had seen and the strange symbols in the house. What had happened to the villagers? And what were those shadowy creatures? That night, as I sat in the guest house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The storm had returned, and the wind held outside, but inside, it was eerily quiet. I decided to do some more research, hoping to find some answers. I searched through my notes and the journal I had found, looking for any clues. As I read, I started to piece together a chilling story. The villagers had been seeing these shadowy figures for weeks before they vanished. The figures could only be seen out of the corner of their eyes, and they seemed to grow bolder as time went on. The villagers had tried to leave, but it was too late. The figures had taken them. I felt a growing sense of dread as I realized that the same thing might be happening to me. I had seen the figure in the village, and now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to leave Aguascalientes the next day and return to Cusco. Maybe there, I could find some help. The journey back to Cusco was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there, but the feeling of unease was overwhelming. By the time I reached Cusco, I was exhausted and on edge. I checked into a small hotel and decided to take a walk to clear my head. Cusco was a bustling city, full of life and activity. But as I walked through the crowded streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. That night, as I sat in my hotel room, I felt a growing sense of dread. The shadows seemed to be closing in around me, and I could hear faint whispers on the wind. I decided to leave Peru and return home. Maybe there, I could find some peace. The journey home was long and exhausting, but I was determined to put the experience behind me. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, but the feeling of unease never left me. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. I don't know what happened to the villagers, but I fear that whatever took them has now set its sights on me. I can only hope that by sharing my story, I can warn others and maybe find some answers. The chef prepared a delicious meal for the guests last night, but I couldn't eat. The shadows were closing in, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me.